Hello and good evening. I'm Melisa Idris. Welcome to Consider This. This is the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider what you know of the news of the day. Earlier this year, the Home Minister Saifuddin Nasution announced that children should no longer be detained in immigration detention centres, pledging to place them instead under the care of NGOs that specialise in the welfare of children. Then in August, the Home Ministry announced that it had relocated some children from existing immigration detention centres to what the government has termed as children-friendly detention centres called Baitul Mahabbah. Now, 23 children and 10 of their parents or guardians have been relocated, and this comes amid plans to move hundreds more to similar shelters. So does this move signify that the Malaysian government is finally willing to put an end to immigration detention in Malaysia? Joining me on the show is human rights advocate Mahi Ramakrishnan, founder of the NGO Beyond Borders. Mahi, thank you so much for being on the show with me. Thank you for taking the time. I wanted to ask you about this move by the Home Ministry to relocate the children to children-friendly detention centres. I'm wondering how you view this development.
I actually feel quite horrified. I don't want to mince my words here because I've said this over and over, and I'll say this again. A golden cage is still a cage. And, like you rightfully pointed out, the Home Minister did say earlier this year that he's going to look at alternatives to detention. And that included what our neighbors in Thailand and Indonesia are already practicing, which is to actually release children into the care of the civil society organizations and also into communities. But this doesn't seem like it because it's well within the compound of the immigration, and there are officers who are going to be in charge, which means that the children are still under lock and key. And this is not what you want for kids. Kids do not believe in detention of any form, in whatever way you call the detention. They actually belong in schools, they belong in kindergartens, they belong in playgrounds, they belong in homes. Definitely not in a place which you say is child-friendly. What does that even mean? And it's equally disturbing for me because I do a lot of work with refugees that the Home Minister said something in passing to the tune of, some of the children being deported to Syria and Myanmar. Now, this really raises my concern because, quite obviously, if they are going to be sent back to Syria and Myanmar, chances are they are refugee children. And yet again, because we have very little to no information coming out from the Home Ministry, this is what I will assume. And I am terrified that, you are going to send them back to a place where they are going to face persecution. And this is also in violation of customary international law, specifically the non-refoulement principle, which clearly says that you cannot send people back to a place where they will face persecution. Now, we can, of course, say that we have not ratified the 1951 UN Refugee Convention, but because the non-refoulement comes under customary international law, we are bound by it. So there are just too many questions than answers following this announcement by the Home Minister.
Okay, so I was quite curious to know what the Home Ministry meant by children-friendly detention centres. I think we've yet to receive an explanation about what that means. But I'm wondering what you believe to be the government's thinking in all of this, in creating these children-friendly detention centres. Do they view this as a positive move, one that they should be applauded for, one that they think might be satisfying activists like yourself?
More often than not, we have to work with the government to look at bigger issues, to look at political will from their side, their buy-in, because as civil society organizations, there's very little that we can possibly do. So most of the time, I think we are very accommodating and we are very kind and generous with our words, but it's that I have come to believe that we cannot wait or allow children their freedom on a stage-by-stage basis, according to a certain phase. Like today, I allow you to stay in what I call a child-friendly home. And, after 2 years from now, 3 years from now, 6 months from now, we will give you more freedom. That is not how freedom works. These children, also, I'm not sure whether they will have access to proper structured education. And more importantly, they have been in detention, which means they would have gone through trauma. I'm actually intrigued when you talk about why do you think they come up with something like this? It's like, oh my God, I'm thinking, why do they even bother coming up with something? And what compels them? This is a self-styled reformist government, and it's quite disappointing when people in the Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim's government are quite happy to actually detain children and call it by another flowery name in the hope that, people will buy into that. And I'm sorry, but I'm not going to do that.
Right. Well, is it still happening, Mahi? Have you heard of whether, under this Madani government, that children are still being taken in and held in detention, in immigration detention, or have they put a moratorium after the Home Minister himself said that actually, they wouldn't want to detain children any longer?
Together with a few CSOs, Tenaga Nita, Sahabat Wanita, Asylum Access, as well as North-South Initiative, we have made so many calls to the immigration for a moratorium on immigration raids until we have an opportunity to sit with the Home Ministers, to sit with people in the immigration, to discuss about where we are coming from, to look at what is actually happening on the ground, why are they actually having this many immigration raids? What happens when a migrant worker is detained? What happens when a refugee is detained? What happens when women and children are detained? Can you please listen to us? Could we please try and come at or arrive at a consensus? And until then, can we have a moratorium? But we have not seen any moratorium. We do hear now and then from our the groups of people that we work with, whether they are migrant workers or refugees, about the fact that they have been tipped off about a possible immigration raid. So I really think that if the government is serious about looking at some of these issues, detention of children, detention of migrant workers, detention of refugees, I think they need to first and foremost have a moratorium, and then they need to engage in a consistent fashion with civil society organizations and community leaders that are actually in touch with ground reality. I also believe that policy and action of the government has to take cue from people who are actually living that experience of being in detention. It has to be community-led, or else we are making policies and thinking that this is the right action because we believe in something. And then that does not necessarily come from anything that translates into ground reality.
Is there that consultation that you speak of? Why isn't there enough of that to satisfy, to at least clue in the civil society organizations as to what's happening with the Home Ministry and maybe the thinking behind the plan for children in detention?
I really do not know, but I can't really come up with a conclusive answer. But from the very many years, we know that Malaysia has become incredibly racist and xenophobic. And we know that this government, has to pander to certain right-wing elements within its government, as well as in the opposition, and also to the larger Malaysian society that has become more xenophobic and racist as a way of scoring brownie points. More often than not, when there is a state election or a federal election, we see refugees and migrant workers, being demonized. There is a rhetoric that comes up against them, and this further exacerbates the hate speech and hate crime, as well as the kind of stress and tension that we see, amongst Malaysians. So I really think that, because the government is at a crossroads where it needs to keep appealing to the larger Malaysian society, who are the voters, unfortunately, it really does not have the political will to really look at, proper constructive engagement with civil society organizations, because, maybe they're just terrified of us coming up with different ideas and they will have to meet us at a certain consensus.
Mahi, just to follow up on what you said then, are the people that you need to convince, or the people that you need to kind of pressure into change, more the public than the Home Ministry? Do people need to change their minds about, or get more informed about what's happening to children in immigration detention?
I really think that, the larger society of Malaysians don't really want to also understand what's actually happening when a raid happens, when people who are refugees and asylum seekers and migrant workers are actually nabbed. Because some of them tend to think that it's true, that they are actually not relevant to the society, or they do not contribute in an effective manner. And this is also because of the years and years and years of playing up sentiments against them, and it's quite clear that it has actually realized into something that is more hate than anything else. Of course, we have got a large society of Malaysians who came forward. We saw that during COVID. We saw that when the floods happened 2 years ago, they came forward and we banded together to do what is necessary for everyone who make up the Malaysian society. But I really think that we need to have more constructive engagement coming from the government. We need to see more progressive statements from the government. We need to see the government vehemently condemn any kind of attack or hate speech against migrants, refugees, and asylum seekers. We unfortunately don't really see this. Like I say, the government wants to pander to the larger Malaysian society, and I really feel sad to say this, but we have become racist and xenophobic over the last few years.
Does that make your work harder? I mean, I can imagine only the challenges and the frustrations you must face in your advocacy work.
Of course, it makes my life and my work really, really difficult. But the thing is, we need to keep appealing to the larger Malaysian society. We really don't have a choice. Because, I do believe that there is a good in everyone. And I do believe it's really about me, conveying what is actually happening on the ground in a manner that is effective. Because, when you do not understand something in its entirety, you get really scared. But once you understand that migrant workers and refugees and the women and children are just like you and me, with the same hopes and aspirations for themselves and their future generation, then that fear dissipates. Now, is that going to be easy for CSOs to take on that obligation? Obviously not. We don't have enough funding. Our fundings have been slashed following COVID, right? So, it's going to be very difficult to do this on our own. So we really need all of government support to be able to do this. But also, we need to make Malaysians understand that they too have the power to stop and ask an immigration officer or to stop and ask the Home Minister as to why they are detaining children. The minute they sit down and have this conversation, they will understand how powerful they are, how powerful their voice is, how powerful their vote is. Every time there is an election, I tell people, please go out there and vote. This is really important. But I doubt that they really understand why it's important. But the minute they understand that, detaining women and children is a no-no, arbitrarily detaining refugees and migrant workers is a no-no, that there is a larger conversation that needs to be had. When they understand that, when they ask their ministers and their elected representatives the questions, the rightful, relevant questions, then they know how powerful they are as voters. They know that they are the kingmakers. And we need to make that happen. It's going to be really, really a difficult thing. So, yeah.
Mahi, thank you so much for speaking with me. That was human rights advocate Mahi Ramakrishnan. We're going to take a quick break here and consider this. After this, we'll come back and talk about alternatives to detention. Stay tuned to consider this. We'll be right back. Hi, welcome back to Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris. Let's continue our conversation about the issue of child immigration detention in Malaysia. Hannah Jambunathan joins us now. She's the Asia Pacific Program Officer for the International Detention Coalition, also the coordinator for End Detention Network, which is a coalition of 21 civil society organizations and individuals working to ensure that no person is detained in Malaysia due to their immigration status. Hannah, thank you for being on the show today. I'm hoping we can kind of zoom out and understand the scope and the context of the issue of children in immigration detention here. What do we know about how many children are in detention? Who are they? How old are they? How long have they been in detention? Are they with their families? Are they unaccompanied? I have so many questions, Hannah, so I'm not quite sure where to begin. Maybe you can give us an overview of the current situation.
Thanks, Melissa. So happy to be here. Thanks for having me. I will try to get to all of your questions, but of course, feel free to just ask if I've missed anything out. So I think I will start by saying that the data, the publicly available data that we have on immigration detention is limited, and NGOs, myself included, are able to piece together from media reports and MPQs from Parliament, and that's how we collect the data. So as far as I understand, as of about 15th of May 2023, there are about 10,000, 11,000 people in immigration detention centers in Malaysia. And of this number, 8,427 are men, 1,775 are women, 542 are boys, and 427 are girls. So this brings us to about a total of 969 children in detention. And this was of May. However, I will say that there seems to have been an increase of children detained. And recently, the Home Minister reported in the media that as of 22nd August, there are about 1,382 children under the age of 18 that were held in detention centers. We don't have access to what the specific age breakdown is, but as I just said, we understand that any children is a child under 18, and this is what was shared. Who are the people that are in detention? There are so many different communities of people: refugees, migrants, stateless persons, essentially anyone that's found to be in contradiction of Malaysia's Immigration Act are held in detention centers. How long have they been detained? Again, not much public available information about this, but according to Malaysian law, there's actually no maximum period of detention. So our law states that any persons can be detained for such a period as may be necessary for their removal from Malaysia. So what this means, especially for refugee communities and stateless people, there's a really high risk of indefinite detention. So as far as we understand, people in Malaysia can be held for years on end in immigration detention.
Hannah, help me understand the reason children are detained. Why are they detained? What law have they broken? Do the immigration laws that that apply for raiding and putting people into immigration detention centers, why do they apply to children? I'm a bit confused on that point.
Thanks, Melissa, for that question. And honestly, it's a hard one to answer, and it's also hard to understand. I think essentially the answer is that within our laws, within our Immigration Act, there is no distinction between children and adults. So I think the only kind of provision that's child specific is to mention that children who are detained are placed with their mothers up until the point that they're 12, and then they're separated and placed in adult facilities according to their gender, often with strangers. So what I would like to highlight here also is that technically anyone who enters or remains in Malaysia unlawfully is at risk of detention. And this includes children, refugees, people seeking asylum. And it's important to note here that immigration detention is an administrative tool. People who are detained in immigration detention centers, children that are detained in immigration detention centers, have committed no crime. They're simply arrested because of being in contrary to this law, which often means that they don't have documents, or they're breaking COVID SOPs, or they are working without a permit, because these are the things that are specified in our immigration law.
All right. So what are the alternatives to detention then? If they have essentially, if this is an administrative tool, part of the management of immigration, what are the viable alternatives that we should be considering?
For people to understand as a concept, because globally and in Malaysia as well, we rely on this framework, this system of immigration detention, which is quite punishing to govern migration. So what are alternatives? What could they even look like? And essentially an alternative could be anything. It's just an approach or a framework that ensures that people are not detained for their migration status, which I think we can all agree and understand that that's not a good reason to detain someone and put them in harsh conditions. So what can alternatives look like? It can be good, positive policy change, legal change, all these practices within our systems to not detain people. It could be programs or initiatives that are human rights focused that help children and refugees and migrants meet their needs in the community. It can be community placement, and kind of what Mahi was saying, it can be a screening tool and assessments to understand people's individual needs before they are placed anywhere. But it's an alternative, is exactly what it sounds, an alternative to immigration detention, avoiding that facility. So what can alternatives to detention look like in Malaysia? I think maybe not many people know this, but Malaysia did try to set up an ATD pilot after many years in consultation with NGOs, almost a decade of consultation. There was an ATD pilot that was approved, and we won't get into the specifics of the criteria because it ought to be expanded and become more rights-based. But essentially what this ATD pilot was hoping to do was to release unaccompanied and separated children from immigration detention into alternative care arrangements with child rights NGOs. And I do want to really emphasize the point that Mahi was saying about the need to collaborate with NGOs and consult with them, because the truth is, so many of the NGOs on the ground have been doing this work for years. And there are NGOs in Malaysia, child rights NGOs in Malaysia, that have ongoing case management and community placement programs. And these are the resources that the government can and should tap into to support better, healthier, more rights-based management of refugees, migrants, and children. And when properly implemented, this is backed up by so much global research and Malaysian local research. When properly implemented, ATD is beneficial not just to refugee and migrant communities, but also to the government, because when their rights are met, they are far less likely to abscond and they comply with immigration requirements when their needs are met. And also, ATD is so much cheaper, significant cost savings, just based on a recent analysis that was done by an external evaluator. Immigration Department shared some statistics that detention can cost anywhere between RM30 to RM80 per person per day, whereas the NGO community-based alternatives can cost less than RM9.
Wow, that's a huge difference. Okay, so there are viable alternatives to detention, available to the Home Ministry. What are the dangers if we don't adopt these alternatives, Hannah? What are the effects of detention on children?
Thanks, Melissa. This is a great question because essentially we are not adopting alternatives right now. There is no ongoing government-sponsored ATD model that's operating in this country right now. And what we are doing to the children is that we're depriving them of their liberty, and we're really, through immigration detention facilities, we're harming children mentally and physically. And this, again, is so much research globally and in Malaysia showed the serious impact that even short periods of immigration detention can have on a child's well-being, growth, and development. And especially in conditions in immigration detention that in Malaysia, we don't have lots of transparency, but Suhakam, for example, has highlighted that conditions in Malaysia can get pretty harsh. Poor nutrition, poor access to healthcare, terrible hygiene and sanitation, exposed to violence and abuse. These are the conditions that we are subjecting children to, especially children. Like, I think about half the children in detention now are without their parents. That exacerbates the negative impact. They're under so much distress and trauma from detention, even a short period. And these impacts can be lifelong. It's just, we have to understand as a community, as Malaysians, that detention of any form is never in the child's best interest, and it's a violation of their rights.
When you say detention of any form, you're referring to not just their detention, but also to the detention of their family members, their providers, their guardians.
Yes, I am referring to that, and highlighting that any kind of center that deprives children of their liberties is not okay, and they need to be released. But speaking more a little bit to your point about detaining, what happens when a family member is detained, I would love to speak to some of the indirect impacts of detention that children face, which, when we're thinking, of course, about children affected by detention, we're thinking about children in detention. But also very important to understand is that domino effect that happens when a family member, a community member, a breadwinner is detained. And there's a myriad of terrible things that happens to children. Firstly, in terms of psychological stability and well-being, detention of a family member causes some significant harm to children. It harms their family relationships. When a parent is detained, it damages that development of a child, the development of their relationship with their parent, and it causes a distortion of who their parents are, who their family is, and this can really impact their sense of stability and well-being. And I think there's also more evidence. In fact, there was a recent report in Malaysia, and it pointed to how when breadwinners are detained, children have to take on such a severe knockdown effect from that. They have to drop out of any sort of informal education that they are accessing. They have to begin working, and that's never okay. And young girls especially face high risks of gender-based violence. They face exploitation, forced marriage, prostitution when they're forced into these vulnerable situations that children should never be in the first place. And the final thing I'd like to say is also that we put them at risk of detention when we
arrest or detain their family or community members. We put them through this increased fear of risk of detention, and what happens there is they freeze, the community freezes, and the consequences of that are, again, children have to drop out of informal education, they can't access health services, they can't go to the clinic when they're sick, they can't play in the community. Some of them even have to move, they have to relocate, they sleep in forests, they move out of their homes because they're in such a situation of vulnerability.
Hannah, in the minute or so that we have left, what message do you have for our audience tonight? What would you like them to understand about this issue that you've been working on?
I think all of this, everything that I've said, it points to the need for a greater conversation about how the Malaysian government can approach and govern migration in a more effective and a more humane way. And I think as the public, and this drawing back on what Mahi was saying earlier, we've got biases, we've got negative biases, and we can all carry these negative feelings towards refugee and migrant communities. We need to sit with that. We need to kind of unlearn that, which is a big word and it's not a comfortable thing to do. But we need to remember that these are also just people and children. We as the public should not be complacent or complicit in depriving them of that dignity. Just keep yourself educated, speak to your friends, family, community members about it, and really make your voice heard. Because without that shift in public opinion, there can be no positive shifts at a policy level as well.
Hannah, thank you so much for joining me on the show. Hannah Jambunathan there, wrapping up this episode of Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris, signing off for the evening. Thank you so much for watching, and good night.